Okay, so let's set the scene. It's April 1945. The Second World War is in its final, agonizing death throes, and the fight has reached the very heart of the Third Reich. We're diving deep into the last claustrophobic chapter of this global war, one that plays out deep beneath a city that is literally on fire. Up on the surface, it is pretty much the end of the world. Soviet artillery is just pounding the city day and night. Fires are raging everywhere, and the air is just thick with smoke and desperation. You know, this isn't really a battle anymore. It's a full-blown apocalypse. But our story isn't on those streets. No, we're going underground, down below all that chaos, into the subterranean world where the final act of this whole tragedy is about to unfold. This is the Furrow Bunker, and let me tell you, it was never designed to be some grand command center for a collapsing empire. It's basically a reinforced concrete box. It's cramped, it's dimly lit, and it's filled with the constant hum of ventilators and this ever-present feeling of just dread. This is where Adolf Hitler is going to spend his last few weeks alive. And inside this concrete tomb, a really strange and fatal disconnect starts to take hold. The world of fantasy and myth that's being lived inside the bunker starts to clash violently with the brutal reality of total collapse happening just a few meters above their heads. I mean, the contrast is just stark. On one side, you have the propaganda myth, right? The all-powerful, charismatic Führer. But the reality, according to everyone who was actually there, was a man in his mid-50s who was ravaged by stress and illness, really just a shell of his former self. His physical and mental health had just completely deteriorated. His left hand shook uncontrollably. His movements were all stiff and jerky. And yet, and this is the wild part, the daily military briefings just kept going. It was like a theater of delusion, where he'd be issuing orders to divisions that didn't even exist anymore, commanding these phantom armies to strike back. And his generals, they knew the truth, but they would just stand there and nod in silence, playing their part in the fiction. This quote from a physician who was actually there, it just perfectly captures the bizarre psychological state they were all in. You know, they were having meals, conversations, even telling jokes, all while the constant shelling from above was rattling the walls. It was this completely surreal attempt at normality, a collective refusal to admit that their entire world was being torn apart right outside.
So now we get to the final 48 hours. This is when a series of betrayals and some really grim news from the outside world finally forces that delusional reality inside the bunker to shatter, and it's what triggers all the final decisions.
And the end comes so fast. On April 28th, Hitler finds out that his most loyal man, Heinrich Himmler, has been trying to negotiate a surrender. For him, this is the ultimate betrayal. Almost at the same time, he hears about Mussolini's fate. This sequence of events just sets everything in motion. A strange, brief marriage ceremony, followed by some quiet goodbyes. The timeline is now set. You see, the impact of Mussolini's death was a huge turning point. The thought of being captured, executed, and having his body paraded through the streets, that became his greatest fear. He was absolutely determined to deny his enemies that satisfaction, to control the final narrative of his own body. And so, the end isn't some dramatic Wagnerian last stand. It's not about the creation of a martyr. Instead, it's a cold, methodical, almost clinical procedure that was clearly planned out and rehearsed. The sequence of events is just chillingly methodical. First, a final cold test. They give a cyanide capsule to his German shepherd, Blondie. The dog dies instantly. With the method confirmed, he and Eva Braun go into their private room. A single, muffled gunshot is heard. The staff enter to find him dead from a self-inflicted gunshot and her from poison. And then comes the final grim step, following his explicit orders. His remaining loyalists wrap the bodies, carry them up to the Chancery Garden, and lay them in a bomb crater. Then, they douse them with gasoline and set them on fire. And the scene, it just captures the sheer chaos of the moment. This grotesque funeral pyre burns for hours, even as Soviet shells are still landing all around them. With the Führer gone, the last bits of the Reich he built just crumble to dust in a matter of days. The collapse is as swift as it is total. The dominoes just fall so quickly. The very next day after Hitler's death, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. 2 days later, Berlin surrenders. And within a week, Germany signs the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe is over. Soviet troops eventually found the charred fragments in the garden. But for decades, all the details were kept secret, locked away in Moscow. And that secrecy, well, it inadvertently fueled decades of conspiracy theories that Hitler had somehow escaped, a myth really born from the fog of war and a lack of any definitive proof. But the true legacy? It wasn't a mystery. It was just devastation. The numbers you see here are almost impossible to even comprehend. We're talking over 14 million people dead as a direct result of the war in Germany and the Holocaust, millions more displaced, and an entire continent left in ruins. This is the world he left behind.
So, in the end, there was no glorious final battle. There was no martyrdom. Adolf Hitler's life ended in a dark, underground room, surrounded not by victorious armies, but by his own paranoia, his failures, and the literal and figurative ashes of his empire.
And all of that leaves us with a final question to think about. The story of the bunker is more than just about the end of one man. It's a stark look at the power of delusion and what happens when the carefully constructed myth of a leader finally collides with a reality that can no longer be ignored.